Shalem and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The overall strategic decision in Washington, at least from former President Barack Obama through his successor Donald Trump and now back to the Democrats with Joe Biden, has been to consider China its number one threat and primarily invest in preparing to meet this challenge. This decision has military, diplomatic, and budgetary implications, including both a withdrawal and a drawdown of forces from less crucial theaters such as the Middle East. To further analyze the American pivot eastward and its implications on the Middle East in general, and Israel in particular, we're joined from Washington, D.C. by Mr. Robert Silverman, who is a lecturer at Shalem College and former president of the American Foreign Service Association. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Also joining us from Central Israel is Ambassador Dani Ayalon, who is Israel's former ambassador to the United States, deputy foreign minister and lecturer at NYU, as well as TV7's co-host of TV7's Middle East Review. Thank you for joining us as well.
Pleasure, Jonathan.
And with me here in the studio is our TV7 analyst and host of TV7's Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir. Oren, Amir, give us a broader understanding, of course, a very dramatic couple of weeks now with the American prompt withdrawal and even faster takeover by the Taliban of Afghanistan, which, of course, had everybody throughout the Middle East observing quite keenly and trying to anticipate what's going to happen next. But beyond that, also the American attitude towards the realities on the ground, and now also China and Iran and Russia and other countries that are opposed to Western dominance, seeking to fill the void also here in Afghanistan and elsewhere throughout the region. What can you tell us about that?
Well, one shouldn't put China and Russia and Iran in the same basket, because the American strategic review, which started several years ago, and as you said, the undercurrents have been in three administrations already, at least, from Obama through Trump to Biden. This is a semi-isolationist spirit. Not all Americans want to go back to Fortress America. Not all of them are saying America first because they understand that it must be an alliance first. Yes, the United States is at the center of the alliance, but it cannot work alone. And it's a question of priorities. You can't do everything, and you must take into account what the market will bear. And the market, in this case, is what the American electorate and its representatives will allow the executive branch to do. And as one looks at trends in American politics and society, including the 2020 census, and what it portends is that down the road, there will not be a lot of support for adventures or military presence everywhere, and certainly, as President Biden noted last week, for nation building. There will be some American military missions, but they will be in key areas. And it seems that the Middle East is less and less one of these areas, of course, because of other trends, oil versus other energy assets or resources. And Israel should take note and know that in 2028, when the current military aid program or security financing program signed by President Obama is over, there may not be an automatic support for continued assistance to Israel if there are other needs. And in the U.S. Armed...
Which is highly unlikely, if I may add. But with that being said, I'd like before
Let's meet here in 7 years and see.
Indeed, but we'll, of course, like to involve our two distinguished diplomats, one from the Israeli Foreign Service, the other from the American Foreign Service. But before we do so, I'd like to touch on two words you said, strategic review. Of course, when the Biden administration entered the office, it highlighted also to the Pentagon, also to the State Department, its intention and executed it, a global posture review, if you will, and declaratively at the time was to pivot eastward with the EastCom and the naval forces, of course, deployments there, and the South China Sea taking core focus of the American attention, of course, at the expense of ultimately the Middle East and elsewhere around the world, excluding Europe, which remains a key strategic ally of the United States in order to execute everything that it wants. But with that comes my question: to what degree, and this specifically also for Afghanistan and other aspects to this region, but to what degree is the way you do something as important as the doing itself?
Well, of course, it looks like a defeat, even though President Trump signed this agreement with the Taliban a year and a half ago, and President Biden announced what he was going to do. And it is not the first time that an army collapses all of a sudden. The French army did in 1940. The Iraqis, when ISIS assaulted. There are even Fatah against Hamas in Gaza 14 years ago. There are apparently trends which have to do with motivation, with training. And the lesson here, by the way, is that Israel should know that both the Saudis as well as the Emiratis will probably not be able to sustain their air forces without foreign contractors as technicians. They may have pilots, they will have shiny fighter planes, but they will not have enough maintainers for their fleets. So even though it is tempting for Israel to consider linking up with these air forces, when push comes to shove, they may not be there. But what you said about China is because in the American view, China is being active, proactive, while the United States is reacting to the Chinese initiatives to encroach on many sea lines of communications and go everywhere.
Well, there was a meeting, and I'd like to ask Mr. Silverman first, coming from the American perspective. Mr. Xiong, who is the Chinese Foreign Ministry's special envoy for Afghanistan affairs, met with the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, the outgoing, during which they agreed, they had a broad consensus about everything to do with Afghanistan and agreed to bolster cooperation with regard to Afghanistan, to increase their involvement in Afghanistan. And that happened on the same day that the United States withdrew its forces and Kabul collapsed. How can we not take note of something like that at a time when, of course, for instance, Pakistan, which is a guarantor of Afghanistan at this stage and has been a host country of the Taliban, which fled from Afghanistan once the United States entered the theater, is a key strategic interest of China, and ultimately has a key role in bolstering the aspects of everything that's ongoing in Afghanistan. And then that same president goes to a NATO ally of the United States, Turkey, and meets up with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and they start discussing of how to strengthen Afghanistan from that perspective as well. Everything seems so strategically complex, but at the same time, it also indicates that you can't just pick everything up and leave and expect China not to enter the theater or other potential adversaries or competitors, if you will.
Right. Well, I agree with you, Jonathan and Amir both. this is a huge tragedy that the ramifications of which are still being registered and taken into account. It's early days. The U.S. is in damage limitation mode. I think if you listen to President Biden's speech last week, in which he doubled down on the decision, I've never seen him so resolute and definitive on a foreign policy issue. I think President Biden is reflecting very much the debates that he had with others during the Obama administration, when, as you recall, in the early years of the first Obama administration, there was a surge, and Biden had opposed it. He felt at the time that he was right. He feels now that he was right to have opposed the dramatic surge in 2009, 2010 of U.S. troops. And he vowed then and is following through now on his promise to limit the U.S. Role in Afghanistan. And so I wouldn't try to universalize what happened in Afghanistan. I don't think it's neo-isolationism. I do think the U.S. public has been clear that there needs to be an end date for offensive military operations in that country, and we need to revert to a counterterrorism role, and that's what's happened. It was messy, it was poorly managed, and the pictures we saw last week on the TV are searing and very saddening. But President Biden was reflecting the overall political interests of the U.S. in limiting the damage in Afghanistan. I wouldn't overestimate that and universalize it, though.
Ambassador Ayalon, your take on this?
Well, I would say, Jonathan, that the writing was on the wall when 3 years ago, basically, a very senior American diplomat, Zalmay Khalilzad, was appointed by then President Trump to preside over the talks between the United States and the Taliban in Qatar. This was showing to everyone that the United States is looking for a way out in a respectable manner, save face. And the Taliban, as the Taliban took it very seriously, they were actually putting the Americans into a lull, if I can say so, by promising different things and, of course, preparing on the ground a takeover. And we have seen it. So it seems like the era of nation building, of boots on the ground, of trying to take over countries and do any mop-up operations is over. And that, I think, bodes pretty well for Israel, if I may say so, because Israel has always boasted, and rightly so, that it never has asked for the United States to send any military or any American troops in harm's way for Israeli interests. We always said that we're very proud to be able to defend ourselves by ourselves, and all we needed from the United States is, of course, the technological, the military, not personnel, but goods, and of course some political cover. And when we look into other allies of the United States, they may be in quite a quandary, whether it's South Korea, whether it's even Japan, if we're talking about the Chinese actions over in the South China Sea, even NATO, which is largely relying on American troops and American air cover. But in case of Israel, I think we are becoming a more valuable asset for the United States. And in many ways here in the region, when you have countries that do rely for their security on the United States, especially against the nefarious ambitions of Iran, then it would be very easy. And I think this is the direction where the United States will outsource Israel in the defense of the region in many perspectives, even just for deterrence purposes. And in that case, I think Israel's value has been very much increased by this very, very sad, I must say, situation in Afghanistan. But all these setbacks of the United States, whether it was in Afghanistan or Iraq, in many ways have played into Israel's interest right here in the Middle East.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, the highlight of what also Ambassador Ayalon said is Israel is a valuable asset of the United States in this region. Of course, a region that has strategic importance for the United States. A third of global oil imports and exports are going through the Strait of Hormuz, also, of course, through the area of Bab el-Mandab and all the adjacent areas. Those are strategic assets, not only to Israel, not only to this region, but to Europe, to China, to the United States. And we cannot emphasize that enough, of course. But at the same time, while Israel has never asked the United States for boots on the ground, there is interoperability between the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force. There's interoperability between the two militaries on lesser levels, on the lower, less technological units, if you will. But at the same time, there is quite an understanding with regard to the significance of the state of Israel being where it is and allowing the United States to use its territory for its own interests as well. How do you see that actually play into the favor of Israel when we're talking about the U.S. pivot eastward? Is this going to damage some of the cooperation that has been so vital for U.S. national security interests, as well as, of course, Israel reaping the benefits thereof?
So, by way of answering, let me make a couple of points. I happened to be at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in 1975, in the spring, when South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. And all of the paratroopers and special forces I met there at the time were Vietnam veterans, and they had mixed reactions. They were sorry to see their investment go down the drain, but nevertheless thought that there must be an end to such wars. And lo and behold, the future of Vietnam was in America's interest. A united Vietnam, independent of both China and the Soviet Union, now Russia, is now an ally of the United States. So this might also happen in Afghanistan, and of course in Afghanistan there are Sunnis. Their cooperation with Iran is far from assured. Yes, you mentioned Turkey. Turkey is Sunni. We can see various alliances there.
Just to put things in perspective, the same regime that hosted and enabled the same people who committed 9/11 are back in power.
Yes, but these are people who were helped by the United States, the Mujahideen against the Soviets in the 1990s. We can go back and forth and look at history from various angles. The United States came into Afghanistan to uproot Al-Qaeda. And because the Taliban hosted Al-Qaeda, they were on the American target list too. But there was nothing per se between the United States and the Taliban. Now, what Ambassador Ayalon mentioned regarding Israel not asking for any American trooper is 98% right. And had he been saying it to a Jewish American audience in Miami, Florida, or Tucson, Arizona, he would have been given a standing ovation. But from 1991 on, we have relied on American help for missile defense. First, when they sent Patriot batteries to help us against Saddam Hussein, and because we still have the protocols with EUCOM, because we cannot protect ourselves against Iranian missiles alone. And
however, these were never used in active battle.
Yes, but if the Iranians shoot at Israel, and there are thousands of American servicemen here, they too might get hurt. So, but in any event, yes, the relationship between the Israeli Defense Forces and the various forces of the United States are as intimate as between the U.S. forces and any other ally. The cooperation, the coordination, there is no real secret between these forces. But this is only on the professional level. the U.S. military salutes the civilian echelons, the elected officials. And if there is no real cooperation between the Israeli government and the U.S. administration, the other stuff will still be helpful. Israel, for instance, has secretly helped the coalition against ISIS. Many Air Force sorties have been launched by Israel, from Israel, into Syria in order to defeat ISIS. Israel never asked for any credit.
Nor has it always ever acknowledged this.
No, it did acknowledge it after the fact, but it did not want to break up the coalition as long as ISIS was there. But this was in Israel's interest. Just asking Israel to play foreign legion will not do, because the Israeli electorate also has a vote in it.
Indeed. Well, there is an individual who visited Israel a couple weeks back who you're both personally familiar with, and also has been part of the diplomatic ranks, at least in the United States State Department, Mr. Burns, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, who came to Israel at the invitation of David Barnea, the head of the Mossad here in Israel, as well as the Prime Minister and Defense Minister, had various consultations and meetings, and there was an emphasis put on this matter in seeking to bolster cooperation vis-a-vis Iran. Now, Burns is one of the facilitators, if you will, of the communications that were established via Oman towards Iran. This, of course, raises plenty of questions, and I'd like to start with you, Mr. Silverman. How do you regard this?
Bill Burns is a great friend of Israel's. I've worked for him twice, when he was Deputy Secretary of State and when he was head of the Middle East Department at State. And he led the U.S. delegations to the U.S.-Israel Strategic Dialogue for many years. So he knows this country, and he knows the region, and he knows what all American CIA directors greatly appreciate and value, which is that Israel is very much a partner, a two-way partner in intelligence sharing. I mean, I've seen data that shows that Israel provides more intelligence, raw intelligence, to the U.S. on counterterrorism matters than all of Europe. Israel is a bigger source of direct actionable intelligence on counterterrorism than the EU. That's an amazing fact. It changes year in and year out, but Israel is a major intelligence partner of the U.S., as well as Amir noted, a defense partner. So I don't think any of us should be concerned about the U.S.-Israel relationship. There were concerns that this Democratic administration would take a very different line. It has shown itself to be a reliable ally of Israel's during the recent war with Hamas. I do think, going back to Afghanistan, my final point would be, we have to watch now the resurgence of Islamicists. They just scored a big victory with the Taliban. And of course, Hamas is a fellow traveler. You can say that they're, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. These are all Sunni extremist organizations that are in the same camp with Taliban. So they've scored a big victory now, and we have to push back against that collectively and watch and monitor very closely.
Ambassador Ayalon?
Yes, I would add to that. First of all, yes, Bill Burns is a good friend of Israel. I totally agree with Robert. First and foremost, he's a diplomat. He's a diplomat's diplomat. So he would always look to find some creative diplomatic solutions. When it comes to Iran, I don't think he came here with any messages from Washington that I would say assuage the concern here of Israel. On the other hand, he was quite, I would say, berating Israel, or at least, raising some red flags vis-a-vis Israel cooperation with China in many fields, not in the least, of course, infrastructure here. But I think when we look into the future, and I very much agree with Robert about the sharing of intelligence between Israel and the United States, which really is a major asset for the United States, a real value added. It's also in the way of technology. And here I want to connect the dots with Amir, who said, yes, it is true that in 1991, when Israel received this 39 Scud missiles from Iraq, Saddam Hussein, at that time, of course, there was nothing about missile defense. Patriot was the only way, but this was short-lived. And since then, we have made really huge strides. And today, actually, it is the United States who's purchasing Iron Dome systems from Israel to protect its troops in various areas in the world.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, of course, you have plenty to say about the intelligence meeting also between Mr. Barnett and Mr. Burns, or Ambassador Burns. But very shortly, from your perspective, is the cooperation at this stage well enough in order to ensure Israel's national security interests are maintained in Syria and elsewhere, considering Tehran's emboldenment also post the inauguration of Raisi?
Nothing is assured forever. It's a constant effort, constant battle, and Israel can be assisted by others, but has to bear the brunt of most of its defense alone. Israel should be careful not to be depicted as a cheerleader for American military involvement where American lives can be lost. Israel is not in the grandstand saying, yes, America, stay in Afghanistan, go elsewhere, fight, die for us. Israel should know its place. It is very powerful, but still modest in comparison to the big powers.
Well, according to its only statement released with regard to Afghanistan, was focused on the humanitarian implications of the situation there rather than anything else. But this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Mr. Silverman, Ambassador Ayalon, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.